There was no sign of a struggle. When investigators finally entered the List family mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, nearly a month after the family had vanished, they found something almost impossible to process. The house was silent, the lights were off, the mail had stopped arriving. A religious radio station was still playing. 5 members of the same family lay arranged together on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom, covered with blankets. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that the killer had searched for valuables, and sitting inside the house was a 5-page letter. It had been written by the man police now realized was missing, John List. The letter did not deny what had happened, it explained it. That single document raised more questions than it answered. How could a father carefully plan the deaths of his entire family, then disappear without leaving a trace? And why did he believe he had done the right thing? This is what we know. Cases like this get buried beneath the headlines. The reason they continue to be examined is so people understand what actually happened, not just the crime itself, but the decisions that led there. Because the timeline of this case reveals something far more disturbing than a single day in November. Long before the murders, John Emil List appeared to be living the kind of life many people admired. He was born on September 17, 1925, in Michigan. He served in the U.S. Army during World War II and later during the Korean War. After military service, he earned a business degree and built a career as an accountant. Those who knew him often described him as intelligent, disciplined, quiet, and deeply religious. Religion was not simply part of his life, it shaped almost every decision he made. He believed in strict rules, clear authority, personal responsibility. His family eventually settled in Westfield, New Jersey, in a 19-room Victorian mansion known as Breeze Knoll. The house was impressive. Large columns stood at the entrance. Tall windows overlooked the quiet neighborhood. To outsiders, it suggested stability and success, but appearances rarely tell the whole story. Inside the home lived John's wife, Helen, his mother, Alma, who occupied her own apartment on the upper floor, and the couple's 3 children, Patricia, the oldest, John Jr., and Frederick. Each followed routines that made the household appear orderly. Church attendance, school, meals together. Neighbors rarely saw arguments. The Lists largely kept to themselves. But beneath that carefully maintained routine, financial pressure had been growing for months. Then came the turning point. In 1971, John List lost his job as an accountant. For many people, losing employment is devastating. For List, it became something he could not allow anyone else to see. Instead of telling his family the truth, he created another routine. Every weekday morning he dressed in a suit. He packed a briefcase. He left home exactly as though he were heading to work, but he wasn't. Investigators later learned that he spent those days riding trains, sitting in train stations, visiting libraries, and searching for employment. Sometimes he simply wandered. Then he returned home at the usual time. His family never knew. The deception lasted for months. Meanwhile, the bills continued arriving. Mortgage payments fell behind, debts increased, utilities were nearing disconnection. The mansion itself had become far too expensive to maintain. Yet John List never admitted how serious the situation had become. His silence isolated him. The more pressure built, the fewer options he believed remained. Investigators later discovered another detail that complicated the picture. Helen had health problems, including a struggle with alcoholism, according to court records and reporting from the investigation. His mother, Alma, frequently criticized him. The relationship between the two had reportedly become increasingly strained. His daughter Patricia had begun pursuing interests that List believed conflicted with his strict religious values. Each issue alone might not have led to violence. Together, inside John's increasingly rigid way of thinking, they became evidence that his family and his life were slipping beyond his control. Years later, List would claim he believed his family faced spiritual ruin. He said financial collapse would push them away from God. He insisted he feared they would lose any chance of salvation. Investigators found no evidence that anyone else in the family shared that belief. But inside List's own writings, that idea became central. As detectives reconstructed the months before the murders, one question became impossible to ignore. When did despair become planning? Because evidence suggested this was not a sudden outburst. It was organized, deliberate, and methodical. List purchased firearms. He continued maintaining the appearance of ordinary family life. He said little, showed little emotion, and according to prosecutors, every passing day brought him closer to a decision no one around him could see. Then came November 9, 1971, a Tuesday. By sunset, 5 people would be dead, and John List would begin disappearing. The morning began like many others. Nothing about the quiet streets of Westfield suggested that one of America's most infamous family murders was already unfolding behind the walls of Breeze Knoll. John List followed a plan. Investigators believe it had been prepared well in advance. He first made sure that only one other person was inside the house, his wife, Helen. She had recently returned home after visiting her mother. Inside the mansion, John used a 9mm pistol. Helen was shot at close range. She died inside the home. There was no frantic attempt to flee, no emergency call, only silence. After killing his wife, List turned his attention to another member of the household, his mother, Alma. She was 85 years old and lived in a separate apartment on the upper floor. List climbed the stairs. He shot her where she lived. Within a short time, 2 generations of the same family had been killed inside the same house. The children, however, were not all home. That fact shaped everything that happened next. Rather than fleeing, John List waited. Hours passed, and the house remained quiet. Then came the return of his 16-year-old daughter, Patricia. She had been at school. She walked into her home believing it was an ordinary afternoon. Investigators determined she was attacked shortly after arriving. She did not know what had already happened inside the house. Later that day, 14-year-old John Jr. returned. He too entered without realizing anything was wrong. He was killed soon after coming inside. The youngest child, Frederick, had been away playing in a football game at school. He was the last to return. He had no reason to suspect danger. According to investigators, Frederick was shot after arriving home that evening. The murders had taken place over several hours, not in a sudden burst, but as each family member unknowingly walked back into the house. 5 victims, 1 offender, no witnesses. Once the killings were over, John List did something investigators would never forget. He did not run. Instead, he began organizing the scene. He moved each body into the mansion's ballroom. The victims were laid side by side on sleeping bags. Their faces were covered. The positioning appeared deliberate. Investigators believed it reflected List's desire to leave the family together in death. Nearby, he turned on a radio. It was tuned to a religious station. The music continued playing inside the empty house after he left. It became one of the most haunting details investigators documented. Then came the letter. Addressed to his pastor, the 5-page document attempted to explain the murders. List described his financial collapse. He wrote that he believed his family would eventually abandon their faith. He claimed he had acted to save their souls before that could happen. The letter contained detailed justification, but almost no expression of grief, no plea for mercy, no request for forgiveness. Investigators later described its tone as calm and methodical. It read less like a confession than an explanation. Before leaving, List continued following his plan. He contacted the schools. He told officials that the children would be away because the family planned to visit relatives. He stopped newspaper delivery. He cancelled milk deliveries. He arranged for the mail to accumulate less noticeably. Doors were locked. The house was secured. From outside, nothing appeared unusual. Days became weeks. Neighbors assumed the family had traveled. The large mansion remained quiet. No one imagined that 5 bodies had been lying inside since November 9. It was not until December 7th, nearly 4 weeks later, that concern finally reached authorities. Teachers had noticed prolonged absences. Neighbors had begun asking questions. A family friend contacted police. When officers entered Breeze Knoll, they found exactly what John List had left behind: the bodies, the letter, the radio. But the killer was gone, and by then, he had nearly a month's head start. The investigation that followed would become one of the largest manhunts in America. Yet despite the evidence left inside the mansion, John List seemed to have vanished completely. For the next 18 years, there would be almost no trace of him. By the time investigators identified John List as the suspect, he was already gone. His car had been found abandoned at a parking lot near a train station. From there, the trail disappeared. No confirmed sightings, no phone calls, no financial activity that clearly led to him. It was as if he had stepped out of one life and erased himself from it. The murders quickly became national news. The image of the quiet accountant who had allegedly killed his entire family spread across newspapers and television broadcasts. The FBI added John List to its list of fugitives. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. Most went nowhere. Years passed, the case slowly grew cold. Meanwhile, something remarkable was happening hundreds of miles away. John List was building another life. Using the name Robert Peter Clark, he settled in Virginia before eventually moving to Colorado. He obtained work as an accountant once again. He attended church regularly. He was described by people who knew him as polite, reserved, dependable, and deeply religious. Nothing about him suggested he had once been the target of one of the most extensive murder investigations in the country. Eventually, he met a woman through his church. In 1985, they married. She knew him only as Robert Clark. She had no idea he had another name or another family. Neighbors later told investigators they had never suspected anything unusual. He kept to himself, he paid his bills, he attended church. He blended into ordinary life. For investigators back in New Jersey, the silence became increasingly frustrating. The evidence inside the List home clearly pointed to John List, but evidence could not reveal where he had gone. Years became decades. Then, in 1989, investigators tried something different. The case was featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh. The producers worked with renowned forensic sculptor Frank Bender. Instead of relying on an old photograph, Bender studied List's habits, age, facial structure, and lifestyle. He created an age-progressed bust, showing what List might look like nearly 18 years after disappearing. The reconstruction was striking. It showed an older man, receding hair, glasses, a fuller face, someone who could easily pass unnoticed in any suburban neighborhood. When the episode aired, millions watched. Among them was a woman living in Richmond, Virginia. She stared at the reconstructed face. It looked familiar, very familiar. She believed it resembled her former neighbor, the man she knew as Robert Clark. She contacted authorities. Investigators quietly compared the information. The age fit, the background fit, the mannerisms fit. Surveillance began. Soon, detectives had enough evidence to act. On June 1, 1989, authorities arrested Robert Clark outside his workplace. There was no chase, no attempt to escape, no resistance. When officers confronted him, the man who had disappeared for 18 years simply went with them. Fingerprint comparisons confirmed what investigators already believed. Robert Clark did not exist. He was John List. One of America's most wanted fugitives had been living in plain sight. The capture stunned people who had known him for years. Many struggled to reconcile the quiet church-going accountant with the man accused of murdering his entire family. Some refused to believe it. Others wondered whether they had ever truly known him at all. But the most important questions were still ahead. After nearly 2 decades, John List would finally have to explain his actions in court. And when he did, investigators heard something they had feared all along. His reasoning had not changed, not even after 18 years. John List's trial began in 1990. There was little dispute about who had committed the murders, the evidence inside the mansion, the letter to his pastor, his disappearance, his assumed identity. Together, they formed an overwhelming case. Instead, The central issue became responsibility. The defense argued that List suffered from severe mental illness at the time of the murders, specifically citing obsessive-compulsive personality traits and major depression. The prosecution disagreed. They pointed to the careful planning, the purchase of firearms, the deliberate timing, the cleanup afterward, the arrangements to delay discovery, and the elaborate escape that lasted nearly 18 years. Those actions, prosecutors argued, showed clear awareness of what he was doing. The jury ultimately agreed. In April 1990, John List was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. He received 5 consecutive life sentences, making parole effectively impossible. Even after his conviction, List continued offering the same explanation he had written nearly 2 decades earlier. He insisted he believed he had been saving his family's souls. He claimed that financial ruin would have led them away from God. He maintained that, because they were believers, they could still reach heaven. What he never expressed was genuine remorse for taking their lives. That absence of remorse has remained one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Psychologists, criminologists, and investigators have studied John List for decades. Some point to overwhelming financial pressure. Others focus on his rigid religious beliefs, perfectionism, fear of public shame, and intense need for control. None of those factors excuse the murders. But together, they offer insight into how he justified the unjustifiable to himself. The house where the murders occurred also became part of the story. Months after the bodies were discovered, the mansion suffered severe fire damage under circumstances that were never fully resolved. The remaining structure was demolished. A new home now stands on the property. Very little remains of Breeze Knoll, but the history attached to that address has never disappeared. John List spent the rest of his life in prison. On March 21, 2008, at the age of 82, he died from complications related to pneumonia while incarcerated. His case remains one of the most disturbing examples of family annihilation in American criminal history, not because the investigation lacked evidence, not because the killer escaped forever, but because of how ordinary he appeared before and after the murders. To one family, he was a husband and father. To neighbors, he was quiet and dependable. To a second community, he was simply Robert Clark, a respectful man who attended church every week. For 18 years, those two identities existed side by side. One was real, the other was carefully constructed. John List was eventually brought to justice. But 5 lives had already been taken, and an entire family had been erased. The case remains a reminder that some of the most devastating crimes are not committed in moments of visible chaos. Sometimes they are planned in silence, hidden behind routine, and carried out by someone the world believed it already understood.